Hey guys, you're about to tuck yourself into bed, but not the one you know. Tonight, your blanket is damp wool, your pillow is a helmet, and your neighbours are rats with better rations than you. Welcome to a World War II battlefield camp, where sleep was less a comfort and more a gamble, and the only dream you had was making it to morning. So before you get too comfortable in your warm bed, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy these gloomy little bedtime dives. It helps way more than you know. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that steady hum, and imagine this. It's 1944, and your bed is a 6-foot trench carved into wet earth. Congratulations, you're alive. The bad news? So are the rats. Your mattress is the mud itself, soft enough to swallow your gear, but somehow still hard enough to make your back feel like a bag of broken bricks. You press your head against your helmet, which you've turned into a pillow, and it greets you with the cold metal stench of oil, sweat, and whatever you spilled inside it last night. The blanket wrapped around you isn't warm so much as it's damp. A wool cocoon of mildew that smells like every wet dog you've ever met, multiplied by 1,000. You'd give anything for Egyptian cotton sheets, but what you've got is field-issued fabric that hasn't been washed since, well, nobody remembers. And then there's the soundtrack, a lullaby of artillery in the distance, punctuated by the occasional crack of rifle fire. Some soldiers said you got used to it, others said you never did, but exhaustion forced you to sleep anyway, even if it was only for 10 minutes before the next explosion rattled your teeth. Historically, battlefield fatigue was one of the deadliest enemies. Men could go days with only scraps of rest, eyes sunken, bodies trembling. Studies later showed fatigue caused more combat errors than alcohol ever could, and it wasn't just the guns keeping you awake. The trenches and foxholes were crawling with lice, carrying trench fever. They burrowed into every seam of your uniform until your skin felt like it was alive. Some soldiers scratched until they bled, creating scabs that never healed because the lice never left. And if the bugs didn't get you, the cold did. Winter in Europe turned foxholes into ice baths. Soldiers kept their boots in their sleeping bags to stop them from freezing solid. In the tropics, it was the opposite. Mosquitoes formed clouds so thick you could barely breathe without swallowing a few. Troops burned wet leaves to create smoke barriers, choking themselves half to death just to avoid being drained alive by bugs. You shift in your trench, shivering, and suddenly feel movement by your ankle. A rat, plump, fearless, and very interested in your last ration crumb. In some camps, rats grew as fat as cats, feasting on scraps and sometimes on the bodies no one had collected yet. Soldiers would wake in the night to find one perched on their chest, staring into their face with glossy eyes that said, "Share or else." The smell is indescribable, a mix of mud, sweat, unwashed wool, rotting food, overflowing latrines, and the sour chemical bite of gunpowder. Imagine every bad smell you've ever known, mashed together and cooked over low heat for months. Some men wrote home that they could still smell the battlefield years later. It clung to their memory the way smoke clings to your clothes after a campfire. Only this campfire was the size of a continent. And yet, despite all this, you had to function. Dawn meant orders. Orders meant moving. And moving meant dragging your sleep-deprived body through mud that felt like glue, while trying to remember which way was safe and which way meant walking into a machine gun nest. In a cruel way, soldiers became experts at half-sleep, drifting in and out of unconsciousness with one eye open, a finger on the trigger, and a rat tugging at the hem of their uniform. So here you are, lying in your foxhole, half asleep, half frozen, and half eaten alive by vermin. Your body is desperate for rest, but the battlefield doesn't care. The war never tucks you in, never whispers goodnight. It just thunders on, and you close your eyes praying that when you wake you'll still be breathing. And if you think sleeping was bad, wait until you see what passed for food. Because nothing pairs with sleep deprivation quite like breakfast that can poison you in 12 different ways. You settle deeper into the damp trench, and the earth presses in around you like a coffin someone forgot to finish. Sleep is supposed to be a human right, but here it becomes an experiment in how much misery the body can withstand before collapsing. You try to rest your head against your helmet, but its hard rim cuts into your skull, and you're reminded that this isn't bedding. It was designed to keep fragments of steel out of your brain, not cradle it through the night. Soldiers across World War II learned quickly that the battlefield was not a place for rest. Foxholes became the standard form of shelter, dug with entrenching tools that looked more like children's toys than serious equipment. A soldier could spend hours scraping mud, snow or sand just to carve a shallow depression, then collapse into it hoping to avoid shrapnel. These pits were never dry. Rainwater collected at the bottom, forcing men to either sit in icy puddles or shovel water out by hand. During the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, the ground froze solid, turning foxholes into jagged ice bathtubs. The only insulation you had was your own body heat, and once that left you, frostbite crept in to finish the job. You can feel that creeping cold now, rising from the soil through your spine. Soldiers often slept in pairs, huddled close to conserve warmth, which sounds like camaraderie until you remember both of you were infested with lice. By mid-war, lice was so common that armies began dusting troops with DDT powder, a chemical that at the time seemed like a miracle, and later turned out to be toxic enough to sterilize lab rats. Troops poured it down their collars and into their boots like talcum powder, and while it killed some insects, the rest adapted and kept crawling. Try scratching your neck with numb fingers until your skin bleeds, then imagine doing it while shells are exploding overhead. The stench of your uniform makes it even harder to rest. Wool fatigues absorbed everything: sweat, smoke, mud, spilled rations, even blood. Soldiers joked that their uniforms could walk on their own after a few weeks at the front, but the smell wasn't a joke. In humid regions like the Pacific, mildew coated fabric so thoroughly that soldiers described uniforms rotting straight off their backs. In colder climates, sweat froze into stiff patches of ice. Either way, you smelled like an open latrine that had been simmering in the sun, which meant that even if you managed to fall asleep, your own stink woke you up again. Rats were the unofficial mascots of every camp. They thrived in trenches, gnawing through ration tins and chewing holes in boots. Some grew as large as cats, fattened by a steady diet of crumbs and corpses. Soldiers recounted waking to find one sitting on their chest, whiskers twitching inches from their faces. They hissed when kicked, often returning to the same foxhole night after night. They didn't just steal food, they spread disease. Leptospirosis, carried in rat urine, caused high fevers, muscle pain, and sometimes organ failure. Imagine trying to sleep knowing the puddle you're lying in might double as a rat's personal toilet. Even when vermin left you alone, the noise of war never did. In Europe, artillery duels could last for hours, shells screaming overhead before slamming into the ground, with a concussion that lifted dirt into the air. In the Pacific, the threat came from sudden nighttime raids, where silence could erupt into gunfire without warning. Soldiers learned to half sleep, bodies resting but minds alert, flinching at every crack or rustle. This constant adrenaline left the body exhausted yet unable to fully shut down. Military doctors later recorded the long-term effects as combat fatigue, a condition that blurred the line between sleep deprivation and psychological collapse. You curl tighter in your trench, muscles stiff, and feel your stomach protest. Rations never agreed with the human body, and indigestion was as common as enemy fire. The infamous sea rations, packed in tins, were dense bricks of meat, beans, or hash that clogged the bowels or sent them into overdrive depending on how long they'd been sitting in the can. Soldiers wrote home begging for care packages with chocolate or dried fruit, anything to break the monotony. Some carried small luxuries like instant coffee packets, mixing them with cold water to stay awake through the night. Ironically, the very stimulant that kept you alert also robbed you of what little chance you had to fall asleep. The absurd solutions soldiers invented highlight just how desperate they were. Helmets became pillows, rifles turned into bedposts to rest against, and rain ponchos were stretched over holes to create makeshift roofs. In the jungle, some hung hammocks between trees, only to wake up covered in leeches. In frozen winters, soldiers stuffed newspapers into their uniforms for insulation, crinkling like scarecrows whenever they shifted. None of it worked well. Every trick only dulled the edge of discomfort, never removed it. Sleep was always shallow, always fragile, always interrupted by cold, bugs, or fear. And then there was the smell of latrines wafting on the night air. Armies dug slit trenches for sanitation, shallow ditches where waste accumulated. In heavily bombed areas, latrines overflowed or were destroyed, leaving open pits that leaked into the soil and water supply. Soldiers joked grimly that the battlefield smelled worse than the battlefield dead, a sour cocktail of human waste, smoke, and decaying food that hung over everything like a permanent fog. Breathing through your mouth only made it worse because you could taste it. Sleep, in the strictest sense, was never guaranteed. Many soldiers went days without more than an hour or two of rest. A British report after the North African campaign noted that troops could march and fight for 72 hours with almost no sleep, but once they stopped, they collapsed instantly, some standing upright before crumpling mid-step. Fatigue became as dangerous as enemy fire. Drowsy sentries missed signals, friendly fire incidents increased, and men simply stopped reacting fast enough to survive. In war, sleep deprivation was a killer that stalked both sides equally, indifferent to uniforms or national flags. You close your eyes again, shivering against your damp blanket, and feel the ground tremble with another shell in the distance. Your stomach gurgles, your skin itches, your boots are soaked, and somewhere nearby a rat squeals triumphantly as it drags off a crumb of hardtack you had been saving. This is not a nightmare. This is what it really meant to try and sleep in a World War II battlefield camp, where exhaustion was the enemy that never retreated. And while the night brings one kind of misery, the dawn promises another. Because when the sun finally rises, you'll discover what passes for breakfast in a battlefield camp, and it may just be worse than the rats. Your eyes are barely open when the light creeps across the battlefield, and for a moment you think maybe the worst part of the night is over. But dawn in a World War II camp doesn't bring comfort. It brings food, or at least something the army decided counted as food, and this was often the second great test of survival. The night had tried to kill you with cold and vermin. Morning would now try to kill you with nutrition. What awaited soldiers was usually a ration pack. For Americans, it was the infamous sea ration, sealed in tins that were almost indestructible. These tins contained meat and beans, meat and spaghetti, or meat and hash, which all tasted suspiciously like the same brown paste with a different label. Opening one meant fumbling with a can opener called a P38, a tiny tool that soldiers carried on their dog tags. It was sharp, awkward, and more than one man sliced his fingers trying to get into a meal he didn't want to eat in the first place. British troops had their own version, known as the composite ration pack, which offered such delights as tins of bully beef, powdered tea, and hard biscuits dense enough to crack a tooth. These biscuits were legendary for their durability. Soldiers joked that if the Germans ever ran out of ammunition, they could simply fire British biscuits from artillery pieces. When softened in tea, they became barely edible. Without tea, they were weapons in their own right. You lift a spoonful of canned hash to your mouth and instantly regret it. The food tastes metallic, greasy, and faintly spoiled. That's because many rations were stored for months in warehouses, shipped across oceans, then hauled through mud before they ever reached a soldier's trench. By the time they arrived, the contents had been cooked by the sun, frozen by the cold, and occasionally gnawed at by rats. Nutritionists later calculated that these meals provided enough calories to survive but not enough to thrive. Soldiers burned through energy faster than they could replace it, leaving many perpetually hungry no matter how much they ate. Field kitchens sometimes offered relief when the situation allowed. Large mobile units, called messes, tried to cook hot meals for troops in the rear lines. These meals were often stew, porridge, or scrambled eggs. But even those came with a price. Kitchens attracted attention from enemy aircraft. There are accounts of entire mobile kitchens being destroyed by bombing runs, because nothing smelled more obvious than a truck full of boiling food in the middle of a battlefield. Imagine finally getting a warm breakfast only to have it vaporized moments later. The Germans, despite their reputation for efficiency, also struggled with rations. Their Eisner portion, or iron ration, contained tinned meat, biscuits, and coffee substitute. During desperate campaigns, men stretched these to absurd lengths, boiling the same coffee grounds 4 or 5 times until the drink tasted more like brown water than anything stimulating. In the later years of the war, shortages grew so severe that bread was padded with potato flour, sawdust, or ground acorns. The result was heavy, bitter loaves that sat in the stomach like a block of cement. Try marching on that, and you quickly realise why morale began to collapse as fast as supply lines. The Japanese soldiers' diet was no kinder. In the Pacific, the standard ration was rice supplemented with dried fish or pickled vegetables. On paper, it sounded tolerable, but in practice supplies rotted quickly in jungle humidity. Soldiers boiled mouldy rice until it turned into a gluey paste, and many were forced to forage for roots, insects, or anything remotely edible. Malnutrition became so severe in some units that soldiers shrank in both strength and weight. A man who had once marched 20 miles with ease could barely walk across a clearing without collapsing. Back in your foxhole, the breakfast tin isn't just unappetizing, it's also dangerous. Many rations cause constipation or diarrhea, 2 conditions that sound minor until you try to handle them in a trench with no proper sanitation. Constipation meant days of bloating and cramps. Diarrhea meant constant trips to a latrine that might not exist, and dehydration that left you weak. Military doctors recorded digestive problems as one of the most common reasons for men being pulled from the line. Bullets may have been feared, but a bad can of beans could ruin you just as quickly. The absurdity of it all was that soldiers learned to crave the strangest things. Powdered coffee became a prized treasure, and men hoarded small packets like gold. Sugar cubes were worth bargaining for, traded like currency between foxholes. Some men risked their lives scavenging local farms or villages, desperate for eggs, fruit, or bread that hadn't been tinned into oblivion. Stories circulated of soldiers frying spam on makeshift stoves made from helmets filled with hot coals, the smell rising like a cruel reminder of home. Of course, not everyone despised their rations. Some soldiers embraced the monotony, joking that at least they knew what to expect. One American unit even published a mock recipe book featuring dishes like bully beef a la mud or sea ration stew. Humour was the only seasoning available, and without it, mealtime was just another insult. You poke the last of your breakfast, which has congealed into a rubbery mass, and wonder how anyone could keep fighting on such fuel. But this was the reality. Armies were powered by tins, powders, and whatever vermin didn't steal first. Food was as much a weapon as bullets, and without it, entire campaigns faltered. Napoleon once said an army marches on its stomach. In World War II, it limped, starved, and shuffled along on cans of greasy meat and crackers so dense they could be used to pave roads. As the tin clanged shut and you wipe the grease from your fingers onto a filthy sleeve, the day truly begins. Your body is sluggish, your stomach unsettled, and you know that soon you'll need more than food. Because what the morning meal always led to was the next ordeal, and nothing in this camp could prepare you for the horrors of using a battlefield latrine. Your stomach churns as breakfast settles, and suddenly you realise there's a more pressing problem than enemy artillery. Out here, relieving yourself isn't a private act. It's a logistical challenge, a health hazard, and sometimes a public humiliation. Forget modern bathrooms with doors and running water. On a battlefield, sanitation was reduced to its rawest form. The army's official solution was the slit trench. Picture a shallow ditch dug hastily with shovels, lined with little more than bare dirt, sometimes with a plank thrown across for balance. Soldiers squatted shoulder to shoulder, trousers around their ankles, rifles leaning nearby in case an air raid interrupted the process. Privacy was non-existent. You did your business while staring your comrade directly in the eye, both of you pretending this was completely normal. The smell, however, was impossible to ignore. Warm waste accumulated in the pit, mixing with flies and seeping into the ground until the stench hung over camp like a suffocating fog. In prolonged campaigns, such as in Italy or Normandy, these trenches overflowed after heavy rain. Waste flowed downhill, contaminating water supplies and turning camps into breeding grounds for dysentery. American military doctors logged cases by the thousands. In fact, stomach illness removed more soldiers from combat in some campaigns than bullets did. The British Army issued instructions urging troops to always dig new trenches uphill from living quarters. That advice was often ignored, which explains why so many mornings began with soldiers waking up to the smell of their latrine leaking into their foxhole. In North Africa, where the desert heat baked everything, latrines became ovens of decay. Flies swarmed in clouds, landing on open food tins as easily as they landed on exposed flesh. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and hepatitis spread with brutal efficiency. Hand washing was a fantasy, since water was rationed for drinking, not hygiene. Soldiers wiped with scraps of cloth, handfuls of sand, or sometimes nothing at all. The result was a cycle of illness that left men weak, dehydrated, and in constant discomfort. The Pacific brought its own horrors. Jungle humidity made waste pits rot within hours, releasing a stench that mingled with mildew and gunpowder. Soldiers reported that some latrines were so overrun with insects they refused to use them, instead venturing into the underbrush and risking snake bite. Worse still, Japanese forces sometimes booby-trapped abandoned latrines with grenades, turning the act of relieving yourself into a deadly gamble. Imagine sitting down and realizing too late that the enemy had mined the very ground beneath you. Armies tried to improve the situation with portable latrine seats, barrels cut in half, and in rare cases prefabricated wooden outhouses. But transporting these into active combat zones was nearly impossible. Most soldiers made do with whatever they could dig. In winter campaigns, frozen ground made even digging impossible. Men resorted to relieving themselves into tin cans, which were then hurled into no man's land under cover of darkness. The unlucky few who missed the throw woke up to discover their makeshift latrine had rolled back into camp. You crouch over a trench now, and the humiliation strikes harder than the smell. There's no chance to relax, no moment to breathe. Shells rumble in the distance, rifles crack sporadically, and flies buzz around your face as you swat with one hand and balance with the other. The pit below steams faintly, and the flies return the moment you chase them away. Your stomach knots, and suddenly you understand why men wrote home saying that the worst part of war wasn't the fighting, but the bathrooms. The absurd part was how soldiers tried to cope. Some sprinkled lime or ash into the trenches to reduce the smell. Others set waste pits on fire, which created a choking smoke that clung to clothing for days. The American military even experimented with chemical disinfectants poured into barrels of waste, but these smelled nearly as bad as the contents they were meant to mask. Nothing truly worked. Latrines remained a shared misery, a reminder that no matter how modern the weaponry became, human biology refused to evolve. The consequences went beyond disgust. Medical records from the war show that up to 1/3 of soldiers in certain campaigns suffered incapacitating diarrhea or dysentery. Entire units were slowed by men doubled over in pain, too weak to fight effectively. Field hospitals overflowed with patients not from wounds, but from waterborne illnesses traced back to contaminated latrines. Commanders recognized sanitation as critical to victory, yet the chaos of war made maintaining standards nearly impossible. And so, every soldier carried the memory of these trenches, not just the smell or the filth, but the indignity of being stripped of privacy, reduced to the most basic human function, in full view of others. Some never spoke of it after the war, not because it was traumatic in the traditional sense, but because it was embarrassing. You could recount battles and bravery with pride. Explaining how you spent half your deployment battling diarrhea in a mud pit was less noble. You finish, stand, and pull your gear back into place, but the stink clings to your skin. It will follow you back to your trench, linger in your clothes, and haunt your next meal. And while you may hope for rest after such ordeals, the battlefield has other plans, because when the sun dips again, you'll face the nightly terror that no latrine could shield you from. The endless suffocating swarms of insects that turned every attempt at sleep into a buzzing, biting nightmare. You lie back in the trench and try to catch a moment of rest, but the first thing you notice isn't the mud or even the smell of the latrine. It's the buzzing. A high-pitched, endless whine that drills into your ears and reminds you that the next enemy is smaller than a fingernail but just as relentless as artillery. Insects turned every battlefield into their private feast, and soldiers became the main course. Mosquitoes were the most infamous. In the Pacific theatre, they were more feared than bullets. The jungles of New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands were breeding grounds for malaria-carrying swarms. Soldiers described nights where nets and repellents offered no protection. Dozens of bites appeared within minutes, leaving men itching, swollen, and wide awake. Malaria incapacitated entire units. At one point, American forces in the South Pacific reported more soldiers in hospitals from mosquito-borne disease than from combat wounds. The military tried issuing quinine and later atobrin tablets, but these came with side effects like nausea and yellowing of the skin. A man could wake up looking like he had been painted for Halloween, still scratching through his uniform and still unable to sleep. The European front had its own problems. Lice thrived in every fold of a uniform. They spread trench fever, a bacterial infection that caused fever, rashes, and aching muscles so severe men could barely stand. Unlike malaria, trench fever didn't kill, but it sidelined soldiers for weeks. The irony was that once the fever subsided, men often returned to the same infested uniforms and caught it all over again. Military records show that delousing stations were set up behind the lines, but these offered only temporary relief. Clothes were boiled, powder was applied, yet within days the lice returned. In winter campaigns, soldiers scratched until their skin split, bleeding into their collars, staining the very fabric meant to protect them. Rats weren't the only pests sharing foxholes. Fleas travelled with them, biting exposed skin during the night. Flea infestations grew so bad in some Italian campaigns that soldiers lined their socks with ash, hoping the fine dust would suffocate the insects. It didn't work. The fleas simply relocated higher, biting thighs, stomachs, even eyelids. Sleep was reduced to a feverish half-doze, interrupted by scratching and swatting, until exhaustion finally forced a man into unconsciousness. Flies were their own torment. Battlefield camps were covered with waste, open food tins, and the bodies of the dead, and flies multiplied in biblical numbers. They landed on wounds, spread infection, and blackened the air around latrines. In North Africa, diaries describe soldiers eating while waving one hand constantly above their mess tins to keep flies off, an action that became so automatic men sometimes waved even when the flies were gone. At night the buzzing never stopped. Imagine trying to drift off while 100 insects explore your face, crawling across lips and nostrils. Soldiers stuffed cotton into their ears and nostrils to block them out, creating a grotesque image of men mummified in scraps of cloth just to make it through the night. In the jungles, other creatures joined the nightly assault. Leeches dropped from trees onto exposed skin, clinging and swelling with blood before being ripped away. Centipedes and scorpions wandered into bedrolls, delivering painful stings that left men swollen and feverish. One report from Burma described a soldier waking to find a tarantula the size of his hand crawling across his chest. He didn't sleep again for 3 days. What made all of this worse was that soldiers couldn't escape. Mosquito nets tore, lice powders failed, and insect bites became infected in filthy conditions. Secondary infections turned small bites into abscesses. Some soldiers carved at them with knives, desperate to relieve the swelling. Military medicine was overwhelmed not just by dramatic wounds, but by the cumulative toll of pests. It's easy to imagine war as bullets and shells, but for every man hit by enemy fire, dozens were made unfit to fight by parasites. And yet, armies tried everything. The US Army coated men in DDT powder, sprinkling it down collars and into boots. British troops experimented with oil-soaked rags hung over beds, hoping fumes would repel insects. Japanese soldiers burned green wood to create choking smoke clouds. Each method had its drawbacks. DDT coated the skin in chalky residue, smoke left men coughing all night, and oil rags stained uniforms permanently. None of it mattered, because the insects always returned. You swat at your own neck now, feeling another welt rising. The buzzing is endless, a background hum of misery. Sleep becomes impossible, not because you aren't tired, but because every nerve in your body is alive with irritation. Even exhaustion cannot silence the itch. You scratch until your fingers ache, then roll over into another patch of crawling insects and start again. The historical absurdity is that in many campaigns, insect-borne illness shaped outcomes. Malaria slowed Japanese advances in New Guinea, typhus decimated German divisions on the Eastern Front, and trench fever weakened Allied soldiers in Italy. The mightiest armies in history were humbled by organisms smaller than a fingernail. Soldiers joked bitterly that they didn't need medals, they needed a bath. You close your eyes, but it's pointless. Sleep is nothing but a myth in a world where every bug sees you as dinner. Your skin is raw, your stomach is still unsettled, and the buzzing hasn't stopped once since nightfall. And when the insects finally fade with dawn, another enemy takes their place. The constant thunder of artillery, a noise so deafening it becomes the soundtrack of your entire existence, shaking the very ground beneath your body and ensuring silence is something you may never hear again. You close your eyes and try once more to rest, but the air itself won't allow it. The world around you never falls silent. A battlefield at night is not a place of peace. It is a constant orchestra of thunder, screams and metallic echoes, all performed at full volume while you attempt to lie in a hole and pretend that sleep is still possible. Artillery is the conductor of this grim symphony. Shells fired miles away whistle overhead with a shriek so high it rattles your teeth, followed by an explosion that shakes the ground like an earthquake. Even when the shells land far from your position, the concussion ripples through your chest. Soldiers described how their ears rang for hours, a high-pitched hum that made whispers impossible to hear. After weeks of exposure, many were left partially deaf. By the end of the war, tens of thousands of veterans carried permanent hearing damage, a condition politely labelled shell deafness. Gunfire added its own percussion. Rifles cracked from hidden positions, submachine guns chattered in bursts, and heavy machine guns roared like mechanical beasts. In forests, the sound bounced between trees, magnifying until you could no longer tell where the shots came from. In cities, the echo rolled down streets, filling every alley with the illusion of danger. You might lie awake listening to sporadic bursts for hours, heart racing, body frozen, waiting for the next volley to crash closer. Sleep, under these conditions, became an absurd dream. Tanks contributed a grinding bass line. Their engines roared as they churned through mud, gears clanking, treads crushing earth and stone. Soldiers in foxholes reported feeling the vibrations long before they saw the machines. Trying to sleep through the passage of tanks was like attempting to nap beside an erupting volcano. The ground shook, the noise pounded in your skull, and the only thing keeping you from total panic was sheer exhaustion. Aircraft added a new terror to the sky. Bombers droned overhead with a heavy hum that filled the night air for hours. The anticipation was often worse than the impact. You could hear the engines circling, never knowing if the payload would drop directly onto your position. The sudden whistle of falling bombs tore through nerves already frayed, and every instinct screamed to run, even when there was nowhere to go. Men wrote in diaries that they could identify different bombers by sound alone. a grim party trick learned by sheer survival. Even nature's silence was shattered. In the Pacific jungles, frogs, birds and insects blended with the clamour of war until soldiers no longer distinguished natural from artificial noise. A snapping twig could mean a nocturnal animal or an enemy patrol. Soldiers often fired blindly into the darkness, triggered by sound alone. In winter campaigns, snow muffled some noise, but then every shout or gunshot carried for miles, creating the illusion of armies larger than they were. Silence itself became suspicious. If nothing could be heard, men assumed something deadly was approaching. The psychological toll of this constant sound was immense. Studies conducted after the war revealed that soldiers deprived of silence often entered a state of hypervigilance. Their bodies never relaxed, muscles tensed constantly, adrenaline flooding their systems even when they tried to rest. Some soldiers reported hallucinations, hearing footsteps that weren't there, or voices whispering through the static of explosions. Sleep under these conditions became shallow, broken into brief intervals and punctuated by jolts of panic every time the next boom ripped the night open. You shift in your trench, covering your ears with filthy hands, but it doesn't matter. The sound passes through bone and burrows into your skull. Soldiers experimented with stuffing mud, rags, or cigarette filters into their ears, anything to soften the impact. Nothing worked. The volume of mechanized warfare was beyond what human senses were designed to handle. The constant bombardment was not just an inconvenience, it was a form of slow torture that frayed minds as well as bodies. Absurdly, some men adapted by finding rhythm in the chaos. Veterans claimed they could sleep through artillery barrages after months at the front, their bodies treating the thunder like background noise. The real enemy became sudden silence, which often meant an attack was imminent. Soldiers joked grimly that the only time they slept well was when the guns were firing non-stop, because at least then they knew the enemy wasn't advancing. It was the battlefield equivalent of a lullaby, only one delivered with high explosives, but adaptation did not erase the damage. Chronic sleep deprivation from noise left men clumsy, irritable, and prone to mistakes. Military medical reports linked countless friendly fire incidents to exhausted troops mishearing commands or misidentifying noises in the dark. The human brain, deprived of rest, began to invent threats. A rustle of leaves became an enemy patrol. A popping tin can became a rifle shot. Every noise became amplified in the half-sleep haze of the front line. You try again to rest, but the next explosion jolts your entire body upright. Your ears ring, your eyes blur, and your hands clutch instinctively at your rifle. The sky glows faintly with the flash of distant fire, the horizon trembling with each impact. There is no escape, no silence, no chance to calm your racing pulse. War has replaced the night with a machine that never stops screaming, and you are trapped inside it. And as if the noise itself wasn't enough, there was another torment waiting in the dark. The cold, a biting, bone-deep chill that crept into every foxhole, turned blankets into frozen boards, and made the act of sleeping feel like being buried in ice. The ground beneath you stiffens as the night deepens, and suddenly the mud that soaked your boots earlier turns to ice. The cold creeps upward from the soil into your bones until it feels like the earth itself is swallowing you whole. Sleep doesn't come easy in freezing temperatures, not when your blanket is a damp roll of wool and your bed is a trench carved into frost. World War II wasn't just fought with bullets and bombs, it was fought against the weather, and for many soldiers, the cold was the enemy that never surrendered. The most infamous example came during the winter of 1944 in Belgium's Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing, and snow blanketed foxholes until soldiers were forced to dig with numb fingers just to keep their shelters from collapsing. Frostbite swept through divisions, blackening toes, stiffening fingers, and turning skin into brittle leather. American medical reports recorded nearly 90,000 cases of cold injury during that campaign alone. Men didn't always die from it, but they lost limbs, and in some cases their ability to fight at all. German troops fared little better. Many of them lacked proper winter gear because supply lines were stretched thin, and Hitler had launched the offensive with the expectation of a quick victory. Instead, men marched in thin boots, wrapped rags around their feet and froze in their trenches. Diaries describe soldiers standing guard duty with ice forming on their moustaches, rifles so cold they stuck to bare skin. The Wehrmacht issued grease to rub into weapons so they would still fire, but no amount of grease could keep men from shivering until their teeth cracked. You clutch your own blanket tighter, but it doesn't help. Wool in damp conditions loses most of its insulation. Soldiers improvise by stuffing newspapers, straw, or even spare socks into their uniforms, creating a crinkling armour against the cold. In Russia, German troops during the winter of 1941 were so desperate that some layered curtains stolen from houses beneath their tunics. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, were issued fur-lined coats and felt boots called valenki, giving them a slight advantage in enduring temperatures that often dropped to -30. The cold became as decisive as any battle plan. At night, sleep turned into a dangerous gamble. Drift too deep and you risked not waking up at all. Soldiers learned to recognize the signs of hypothermia, confusion, sluggish speech, the overwhelming urge to sleep. Men shook each other awake in foxholes, terrified that their comrades would simply slip into the snow and vanish. Commanders ordered men to stomp their feet and clap their hands at intervals, turning entire platoons into reluctant choirs of shivering percussionists. It looked absurd, but it kept circulation moving just enough to ward off frostbite. Food became another cruel factor. Rations froze solid, tins of beans turning into blocks of ice that had to be thawed with body heat before eating. Soldiers tucked cans under their armpits or in their boots, waiting hours just to soften the contents. By the time the meal was edible, it tasted of sweat, metal, and desperation. Hot meals were rare because lighting fires risked attracting enemy attention. More than one soldier fell asleep holding a frozen tin, too tired to wait for it to thaw, chewing half-frozen meat like a starving dog gnawing on a bone. Weapons suffered too. Rifles jammed when lubricants congealed in the cold, machine guns froze solid, and mortars misfired as ice built up in the tubes. Soldiers kept their guns under blankets with them, treating rifles like bedmates. The heat of their bodies sometimes kept the weapons functional, but it also meant rolling over onto a cold piece of steel in the middle of the night. The romance of war quickly fades when you realize your sleeping partner is a rifle you dare not let freeze. Even bodily functions became ordeals. Latrines in winter were nothing more than icy pits, and soldiers dreaded them more than combat. Removing layers of clothing in sub-zero weather meant risking frostbite on exposed skin in mere minutes. Some men relieved themselves in bottles or cans inside their foxholes, only to wake up with frozen waste beside them. The smell was unforgettable, but so was the alternative. In Russia, Soviet troops were known to issue wooden seats over pits just to make the process slightly more tolerable. German soldiers envied even that small luxury. The absurd adaptations kept piling up. Socks were boiled to soften them, then dried on shoulders during marches. Blankets were cut into strips to wrap around boots. Men lit candles inside helmets to warm their faces, creating tiny furnaces that barely produced enough heat to stop frostbite but filled trenches with smoke. Humour became a strange shield. Soldiers joked that they'd been issued 2 blankets, 3 socks, and 1 block of ice in the shape of a foxhole. In reality, they had little more than rags and stubbornness. You curl tighter into your trench, the air slicing your lungs with every breath, and realise that sleep has become impossible. The cold is too sharp, too insistent. Your joints ache, your fingers throb, and your boots feel like iron coffins encasing your feet. Somewhere nearby, a comrade mutters in his half-sleep, teeth chattering loud enough to echo. The sound joins the distant thunder of artillery until the entire battlefield becomes one endless rattle of steel, gunpowder and bones vibrating against the chill. History remembers the great battles and the generals who led them, but for the men on the ground, winter was often the fiercest opponent. No medal was awarded for surviving a frozen night in a foxhole, yet those who did so carried scars more permanent than bullet wounds. Their toes turned black, their joints stiffened for life, and their memories of sleeping in ice never thawed. And as the long night drags on, you find yourself longing for warmth. But warmth is rare here, and when it comes, it brings its own misery. Because in other parts of the war, soldiers lay awake not in frozen trenches, but in jungles so hot and humid they drowned in sweat before they ever had the chance to dream. The air around you thickens until it feels less like atmosphere and more like soup. Each breath drags humidity into your lungs, and your skin refuses to dry. You're lying in a foxhole, not of frozen dirt this time, but of steaming jungle earth, and the heat is relentless. Sleep in the tropics during World War II was less about closing your eyes and more about negotiating with your own body. The Pacific Theatre defined this misery. Islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines were furnaces disguised as forests. Daytime temperatures regularly climbed into the high 90s, while the humidity clung at nearly 100%. At night, there was no relief. The air sat heavy and damp, wrapping itself around every soldier like a suffocating blanket. Uniforms, already soaked in sweat, never dried. Men would peel off their shirts at night only to discover they weighed twice as much from absorbed moisture. The phrase "air you could chew" appeared in more than one diary entry. The human body reacted with predictable revolt. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke were constant threats. Soldiers collapsed during marches, their bodies unable to shed heat through sweat that no longer evaporated. At night, exhaustion made them collapse in their foxholes, but true rest never came. Skin prickled with heat rash, a constant itch that spread across the torso and limbs until men scratched themselves raw. Sleeping became a matter of lying still while your own body boiled quietly in its shell of wool and cotton. Malaria lurked in the background, carried by mosquitoes that thrived in the damp air. But even when disease spared a soldier, the insects did not. Clouds of mosquitoes and midges descended at dusk, buzzing into ears and mouths until men pulled blankets over their heads just to create a shield. Of course, blankets only made the heat worse. Soldiers sometimes doused themselves with mud as a makeshift repellent, trading one layer of misery for another. The Japanese army, accustomed to the climate of Asia, often fared slightly better, but not by much. Soldiers stationed in Burma and the Pacific also struggled with tropical heat. Their rations spoiled faster, their uniforms rotted, and their energy drained just as rapidly. Both sides were locked in battles not only against each other, but against a climate that demanded constant tribute. Diaries speak of men lying awake with sweat pooling in their ears, dripping down their backs and soaking their bedding until it smelled like a compost heap. Diseases unique to the tropics thrived in these conditions. Dengue fever, known as breakbone fever, swept through units with headaches, joint pain, and fever that left men shivering even in 90-degree heat. Jungle rot, a fungal infection, ate away at feet and legs, leaving open sores that refused to heal. Soldiers spent their nights scratching rashes, rewrapping bandages, and trying not to think about the smell of their own bodies decaying by inches. The heat didn't just make you sweat, it stripped away dignity. Equipment turned against its owners. Helmets became ovens, trapping heat against the scalp until men resorted to balancing them on sticks at night just to let air circulate. Rifles grew slick with condensation, ammunition corroded, and radios shorted out when humidity seeped into the wires. Soldiers went to sleep not just dreading mosquitoes, but also dreading the moment their rifle failed the next morning because it had sweated alongside them all night. The absurd adaptations multiplied. Some men dug shallow pits in the jungle floor, hoping cooler air would settle at the bottom. Instead, the pits filled with stagnant water and frogs. Others stripped down entirely, lying naked in their foxholes, only to wake up covered in leeches and bites. Cigarettes became impromptu insect repellent. their smoke curling around faces as men tried to doze off with a glowing ember balanced between fingers. The army officially discouraged it, but unofficially, nicotine haze became the lullaby of choice. Humour once again crept in as a survival tactic. Soldiers joked that they had joined not an army but a sauna, and that each battle was just an interval between steam baths. One American wrote home that his foxhole was so humid he half expected fish to swim through it. Another claimed his sweat-soaked uniform had developed its own ecosystem and would likely apply for independent citizenship. These jokes masked the truth that the heat wore down morale as much as combat. A man deprived of cool air for weeks was less a soldier and more a slow-cooked stew of frustration and fatigue. You roll onto your side trying to find a patch of dry ground, but none exists. The soil is soft and damp, pressing its smell of rot into your face. Frogs croak in the distance, insects whine, and the air tastes faintly of mildew. Your own sweat drips into your eyes, stinging them shut. Sleep is a negotiation you always lose. The only thing that truly arrives with night is more heat, more insects, and the endless reminder that no breeze will save you here. The wider impact of this climate was enormous. Campaigns slowed not because of enemy fire, but because soldiers were too weak, sick, and sleep-deprived to advance. Generals studied malaria maps as carefully as they studied enemy positions. Supply officers scrambled to distribute atabrine tablets and salt pills, but the men hated both. Atabrine left them nauseous and yellow-skinned, while salt tablets felt like swallowing chalk. Still, they took them, because not taking them meant collapsing under the weight of disease and dehydration. So you lie in the thick air, eyes half closed, body slick with sweat, and you realise that even the simplest act of sleep has been turned into a battlefield of its own. The cold may have frozen soldiers awake in Europe, but here in the Pacific the heat smothered them alive. And just when you think the climate has claimed victory, you are reminded of yet another enemy that stole rest in every theatre of war. The infestations inside the very clothing you wore, crawling and biting until you wondered if the uniform itself had joined the fight against you. The fabric clings to your body like a second skin, only this one seems to be alive. You shift in your foxhole and realise it isn't just mud and sweat weighing down your uniform. It is the steady crawl of insects burrowed into the seams, the endless itch that no scratching can silence. World War II soldiers didn't just wear their uniforms, they were consumed by them. Lice were the constant companions of every front. They hid in collars, seams, and the folds of wool. Once they found a home in fabric, they multiplied until every inch of your body itched. Trench fever, caused by the bites of these parasites, was rampant across Europe. Symptoms included high fever, rashes, and muscle pains that felt like knives twisting into joints. It rarely killed, but it could knock men out of action for weeks. The real cruelty was that once the fever broke, soldiers returned to the same infested clothes and the cycle started again. Military doctors described lice as the unofficial enemy of the war, and unlike human armies, these ones never surrendered. Fleas added to the misery. Carried by rats, they leapt into bedrolls and uniforms, biting in clusters until skin was dotted with red welts. Some soldiers lined their socks with ash, or dusted their clothes with talcum powder, hoping to smother the pests. Nothing worked. Fleas ignored boundaries, biting soldiers awake at night and making every attempt at rest a desperate scratching session. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical one. Imagine lying in a trench, shells exploding overhead, and still finding yourself more focused on the flea gnawing at your ankle than the artillery rumbling in the distance. Uniforms themselves became breeding grounds for bacteria. Wool and cotton soaked up sweat, mud, and blood, then baked under sun or froze in winter. After days without change, the fabric stiffened with grime, giving off a stench that clung to skin. Soldiers joked their uniforms could stand on their own if propped against a wall, but humour masked disgust. In tropical campaigns, mildew coated uniforms so thoroughly that men described pulling on shirts that smelled like rotting vegetation. In colder climates, damp wool froze solid, cracking like boards when bent. The absurdities piled higher with each campaign. In Russia, German soldiers in 1941 lacked proper winter clothing, so they stole coats, scarves, and even curtains from villages. These improvised garments offered little warmth and quickly became infested with lice. Soviet troops fared better with fur-lined coats and felt boots, but even their uniforms rotted under the strain of endless damp. In the Pacific, American uniforms rotted so fast that seams unravelled mid-march, leaving men clutching trousers that disintegrated as they moved. Soldiers wrote home that the jungle was devouring them piece by piece, starting with their clothes. Delousing stations became a grim routine. Behind the lines, men stripped naked while their uniforms were boiled, dusted, or sprayed with DDT powder. For a few brief hours, they experienced the sensation of clean skin. But as soon as they returned to the front, lice returned with them. Soldiers compared the process to bathing in holy water, only to be thrown back into hell moments later. By 1943, entire armies were coated in the chalky residue of DDT. Soldiers rubbed it into their hair, poured it into their boots, and still found insects crawling. Later generations would discover the chemical's toxicity, but at the time, it was seen as the only weapon against an unstoppable plague of pests. The itch became a form of torture. Medical records note soldiers scratching until they drew blood, reopening scabs night after night. Fingers became raw from constant clawing. Some soldiers carried small knives or pins to dig at bites, risking infection but desperate for relief. The resulting sores festered in filthy conditions, adding another layer of suffering. It is difficult to imagine bravery in combat when you cannot sit still long enough to close your eyes. And then there was the smell. Combined with sweat, mildew, and unwashed bodies, infested uniforms became unholy relics. Foxholes reeked of men and fabric decaying together. Soldiers stopped noticing after a while, their noses numbed by constant exposure, but newcomers gagged upon arrival. In some cases, commanders noted that soldiers could be smelled before they were seen. A column of marching men coated in filth created a wave of odour that hung in the air for hours. You scratch at your collar again and feel the unmistakable twitch of something crawling. Sleep becomes impossible, not just from the itch but from the paranoia. Every sensation feels like a bite. You swat at your chest, your legs, your arms, never satisfied, always certain that more insects are waiting. Insects were not just nuisances, they were reminders of helplessness. No weapon, no strategy, no bravery could fight them. Yet soldiers adapted in absurd ways. Some shaved their heads completely, hoping to deny lice a place to nest. Others slept in partial uniforms, stripping off shirts or trousers, only to wake up bitten raw in exposed areas. Men joke that they had joined the Louse Battalion, an enemy unit that fought with equal ferocity and better morale. In rare moments of dark humour, soldiers compared body lice to medals, proof that they had seen combat. After all, no one escaped without carrying some. The uniform that was meant to protect you instead turned into a second battlefield. It cut your skin, infected your body, and never let you rest. Every itch was a reminder that the war never left you alone, not even in your most private moments. And when you finally did collapse into shallow sleep, it was only to be awakened again, not by insects or cold, but by the smell of your own comrades, an odour so powerful it clung to every breath and made the very air taste rotten. The air presses against your face as you sink into the trench, and you realise the night has a presence of its own. Not a silence, not a stillness, but a smell. A dense, foul mixture that clings to your nostrils and coats the inside of your throat. You're trying to breathe, but every breath reminds you that World War II camps were not just battlefields, they were olfactory prisons. Start with the obvious. Hygiene was a luxury almost no soldier could afford. Baths were rare. Showers were rarer. In some campaigns, men went weeks without soap, water, or even a change of clothes. Sweat built up in layers, mixing with dirt until it hardened into crusts on the skin. Uniforms became stiff with grime, socks rotted through, and boots stank of mildew and fungus. A trench or foxhole wasn't just damp earth, it was a stew of sweat, filth, and unwashed humanity. Soldiers joked bitterly that they could identify comrades blindfolded by smell alone. Add to this the stench of rations. Cans of meat and beans leaked grease, spilling into the mud where it went rancid under the sun. Half-eaten tins were tossed aside, only to be reclaimed by rats, flies, and decay. In hot climates, food spoiled almost instantly. Soldiers described foxholes that smelled like compost heaps, a combination of rotting meat, spilled coffee, and half-chewed biscuits fermenting in the heat. It was the smell of survival turned sour, a constant reminder that nourishment always came at the price of nausea. Latrines contributed their own chorus. Slit trenches filled quickly, and when they overflowed, the stench rolled downhill into camps. In some cases, the smell became so powerful that soldiers gagged while trying to sleep, pressing rags against their faces to block it out. Burning waste was the army's solution, and while it reduced the piles, it replaced one horror with another. Thick, acrid smoke billowed over camps, stinging eyes and settling into lungs. Soldiers half-seriously wondered whether the smoke or the waste was worse. Dead bodies lingered in the background too. On active fronts, corpses could not always be collected immediately. They lay in no man's land, or even beside trenches, decomposing in heat or freezing stiff in snow. The smell of death seeped into everything. Soldiers wrote of nights when the wind shifted and carried the unmistakable sweetness of decay into their foxholes, a smell so distinct it silenced conversations. It was not just an odour, but a reminder of mortality, drifting in on every breeze. Even healthy bodies betrayed themselves. Soldiers lived on diets of canned meat, beans and bread, all washed down with coffee or powdered drinks. The result was gas, constant and overwhelming. Camps became theatres of digestion, where every man contributed to an invisible assault on his comrades. Soldiers joked about it, of course, but the humour didn't mask the truth. In an enclosed trench or dugout, the combined stench of dozens of men was enough to make the air itself unbreathable. And then there were the boots. Leather soaked through with sweat and rain began to rot on the foot. Trench foot, a condition where dampness ate away at flesh, left wounds that oozed and reeked. The smell of infection clung to socks, spreading through entire platoons. Field hospitals recorded thousands of cases where soldiers arrived not just with blisters, but with feet that smelled so foul doctors remembered them decades later. Your boots, in other words, were not just footwear. They were portable stink bombs attached permanently to your legs. In the Pacific, the jungle added another layer. Rotting vegetation filled the air with the musk of mildew. Every leaf seemed to sweat, releasing damp odours that mixed with the stench of unwashed men. The jungle floor itself gave off a smell of fermentation, like the entire landscape was brewing a sour drink beneath your feet. Soldiers compared it to living inside a compost bin, one large enough to stretch for miles. The absurd attempts to mask it were almost comical. Soldiers stuffed peppermint or tobacco in their mouths, hoping the strong flavours would overpower the stench. Others carried small bottles of aftershave or cologne from home, dabbing it on their collars. Within minutes, the sweet scent mingled with sweat and filth, creating a smell somehow worse than before. Some men simply smoked constantly, clouding their foxholes with tobacco as if they could fumigate the air. Cigarettes became less a habit and more a survival tool against their own nostrils. Sleep under these conditions was shallow at best. You could never relax when the air itself felt poisonous. Men pressed blankets over their heads, only to suffocate in their own sweat. Others buried their faces in the dirt, inhaling mud as though it offered relief. But the smell was inescapable. It crawled into noses, clung to hair, seeped into blankets. Long after soldiers left the battlefield, veterans recalled that the odours of war haunted them more vividly than the sights or sounds. You shift in your hole, gagging faintly as the wind shifts and delivers a fresh wave of human stench. The air tastes rotten, sour with the essence of bodies and waste and decay. Every breath feels like swallowing filth. It is inescapable, and it makes sleep a joke. Your only comfort is knowing that everyone around you smells just as bad, though this is a comfort only in theory. In practice, the odour is as relentless as the enemy, a constant assault that seeps into every dream. And if the smell wasn't enough, the body added another insult. Exhaustion was so overwhelming that soldiers began to fall asleep mid-task, collapsing into trenches or onto rifles, unable to resist any longer. The enemy may have been firing, the latrine may have been overflowing, the stench may have been unbearable, but the body eventually shut down. Which meant that the next torment of the battlefield was not staying awake, but falling asleep in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and paying the price for it. Your eyelids sink lower, heavy with fatigue, and suddenly you understand the real danger of the battlefield. It isn't just bullets, shells, or disease. It's the creeping weight of exhaustion that drags you under even when you know sleep could kill you. In World War II, men discovered that the line between rest and ruin was as thin as the edge of a helmet. Armies demanded constant vigilance. Soldiers were ordered to stand watch through the night, scanning for enemy patrols, aircraft, or sudden artillery barrages. But after days without proper sleep, bodies gave out. Guards nodded off at posts, rifles slipping from their hands. Diaries describe men being kicked awake by officers, their heads lolling forward even as shells landed nearby. Punishment for sleeping on duty could be severe. In some armies it meant court-martial, prison, or worse. Yet the human body didn't care about regulations. When exhaustion set in, sleep came whether a man wanted it or not. Military studies after the war revealed how little rest soldiers actually received. Many frontline troops averaged only 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night, often broken into short bursts. Some went 48 hours without closing their eyes. Sleep deprivation blurred vision, slowed reaction time, and made soldiers hallucinate. Men reported seeing entire enemy units that weren't there, or mistaking bushes for advancing troops. In Italy, one British soldier described waking up mid-march to find he had been walking in his sleep for half an hour. The consequences were sometimes immediate. A drowsy sentry missed signals of approaching enemy patrols, leading to surprise attacks that cost lives. Artillery crews misread coordinates, sending shells onto friendly positions. Pilots who flew missions without rest risked falling asleep mid-flight, a danger so common that air forces issued tablets of benzodrine to keep them awake. These pills worked, but at the cost of jittery nerves, paranoia, and eventual collapse when the stimulant wore off. Soldiers joked that the war was fought on beans, bullets, and benzodrine, a grim truth wrapped in bitter humour. You slump further into your trench, body begging for rest, but the dangers are everywhere. Collapse in the open, and you risk being spotted by snipers. Sleep too close to a fire, and you could suffocate on smoke. Fall asleep on patrol and you might vanish into the jungle, only to wake up surrounded by enemies. Accounts from the Pacific describe men who sat down for just a minute in the underbrush and were never seen again. The jungle didn't forgive carelessness, and fatigue made every man careless eventually. Even in safer positions, exhaustion exacted a toll. Field hospitals filled not only with wounded, but with soldiers whose bodies simply broke down under the strain of sleeplessness. Doctors noted symptoms that mirrored insanity: trembling hands, vacant stares, sudden outbursts of rage or laughter. One American officer called his division a parade of zombies, men moving mechanically from task to task, unable to think clearly yet still expected to fight. The absurd coping mechanisms became legendary. Some men tied strings from their rifles to their fingers, hoping the tug of a dropped weapon would wake them. Others propped their eyelids open with matchsticks, a cartoonish solution that rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Units rotated guard shifts in cycles as short as 20 minutes, trying to keep men awake by never giving them enough time to fully relax. In the air, bomber crews pinched each other, slapped their faces, or poured cold coffee over their heads just to avoid nodding off mid-mission. And then there were the micro-sleeps. Soldiers learned that the body could snatch seconds of unconsciousness without permission. Men drifted off during firefights, waking with no memory of how much time had passed. Tank crews nodded off between shell bursts, only to snap awake at the next impact. These stolen moments never restored energy, but they revealed how desperate the brain was to shut down. Sleep became less a choice, and more a thief that struck without warning. You feel it yourself now, the edges of reality blurring as your head dips forward. The sounds of war fade into a dull hum, replaced by strange visions. For a moment you think you're home, lying in your own bed. Then the cold mud seeps into your cheek and the illusion shatters. You're still in the trench, still in the war, and still at the mercy of exhaustion. The body has no loyalty to discipline. It demands rest, and if you cannot give it willingly, it will take it anyway. History recorded countless battles, but rarely the quiet collapses that shaped them. Units slowed, mistakes multiplied, and soldiers died not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked sleep. It is one of the great unspoken truths of war. Victory often went to the army that stayed awake longest. And in a world where rest was stolen by noise, insects, cold, heat, filth, and fear, that meant every soldier was fighting not just the enemy but their own body. You rub your eyes, forcing yourself upright, because you know that falling asleep in the wrong place could be your last mistake. But even as you try to resist, another misery waits in the shadows. For in many camps, it wasn't the enemy or exhaustion that startled soldiers awake. It was the rats, bold and fat, clambering across bodies in the night and turning foxholes into their own personal banquet halls. You shift in the dirt trying to find a position that doesn't ache, and then you feel it. A brush of fur against your boot, quick and deliberate. In the dark, the first thought isn't that it's the enemy. It's that the foxhole has been invaded by rats. They were not just background pests. They were residents, squatters who treated trenches and camps as their kingdom, and every soldier became their unwilling landlord. World War II rats were enormous, fattened by the endless banquet of war. They gorged on discarded rations, gnawed through supply sacks, and grew bold enough to raid sleeping soldiers. Some men swore the rats in Europe were as large as cats, their bellies swollen from feasting on corpses in no man's land. In the Pacific, the jungle variety wasn't much smaller, and they were fearless. Soldiers recounted nights when rats scrambled across their chests, whiskers twitching inches from their faces, eyes gleaming with the confidence of creatures who knew no one could dislodge them permanently. Rats followed armies wherever they went. In North Africa, they nested in supply depots. In Italy, they overran ruined buildings, chewing through crates of ammunition as readily as they chewed bread. On the Eastern Front, rats burrowed under snowbanks, thriving in the warmth of trenches. Soldiers set traps, burned nests, and killed them by the dozen. But for every rat removed, 10 more seemed to arrive. War was good business for vermin, and they multiplied with every passing month. Their presence wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Rats carried fleas that spread disease. Leptospirosis, transmitted through rat urine, caused fever, headaches, and organ damage. In the Pacific, outbreaks left entire units incapacitated. Food contamination was constant. A soldier might open his ration tin to find it gnawed at, teeth marks carved into the lid. Bread loaves disappeared overnight, carried off piece by piece into burrows. Even water supplies weren't safe. Rats drowned in barrels and wells, their bloated bodies poisoning what little hydration soldiers had. You pull your blanket tighter, but it's no shield. Rats bit through fabric to reach crumbs in pockets. Men described waking to find gnawed holes in their gear, their soap bars chewed to nubs, and their boots filled with droppings. The creatures were relentless. British soldiers in Italy told of rats bold enough to tug at their hair while they slept. American troops in the Pacific swore the animals gnawed on their ears and fingers if food wasn't available. Whether all of these accounts were true or the exaggerations of exhausted men hardly mattered. The psychological terror was real. Even attempts to fight back often failed. Soldiers shot rats with pistols, wasting precious ammunition in the process. Bayonets and knives skewered a few, but the smell of rotting carcasses only made the stench of camps worse. Cats and dogs were sometimes kept as unofficial mascots, their sole duty to hunt vermin. Yet even these animal allies couldn't keep up. In some areas, the rats outnumbered men 100 to 1. Diaries noted that rats often watched from the edges of fires, waiting patiently until soldiers drifted to sleep before launching their nightly raids. And the noise, the scratching, scurrying and squealing echoed through trenches in the dark. Sleep was already fragile, and every scrape of claws against dirt jolted nerves awake. Men flinched at every sound, unsure whether it was vermin or enemy patrols. The result was a constant cycle of half-sleep, waking to check for danger, then drifting off again until another rat rustled. In this way, the rodents were as effective at depriving soldiers of rest as artillery. The absurd measures soldiers invented bordered on comedy. Some tied their rations in bags and suspended them from branches like Christmas ornaments, only to wake and find rats hanging from them anyway. Others built makeshift cages from wire, which the rats chewed through by morning. A few desperate men even slept with their food inside their uniforms, only to discover the rats simply followed. One American wrote that the rats in his foxhole were better quartermasters than the army, because they always found the rations first. On the Eastern Front, the problem grew grotesque. During sieges where corpses lay uncollected, rats gorged on the dead. Soldiers told of hearing them chewing in the dark, the sound carrying across trenches like macabre whispers. The knowledge that vermin feasted on comrades while they tried to sleep etched into memories more deeply than the roar of guns. Some soldiers claimed the rats grew fearless because of it, approaching living men as if they were simply meals waiting their turn. You swat at the ground, chasing one away, but the scratching continues. The foxhole is alive with movement. The rats don't wait for you to rest. They force their company on you, squealing and biting, clambering over your body like you are part of the landscape. Their smell mixes with the already rancid stench of the camp, a musky tang that never fades. You squeeze your eyes shut and try to ignore it, but it's impossible. Sleep is now a shared space with the battlefield's most persistent scavengers. And this wasn't just an inconvenience. The morale damage was immense. Soldiers wrote of losing their minds, not from combat, but from living with vermin that invaded every moment. Imagine fighting a world war while simultaneously waging a nightly war against creatures too small to aim at. For some, it was the final straw. Men prayed for transfers, begged for relief, and cursed the armies for not solving what seemed like a basic problem. Yet the truth was simple. Rats were as much a part of the war as rifles, and no one had figured out how to defeat them. So you lie awake, clutching your gear tighter, and resign yourself to another night of gnawing, scratching, and squealing. The rats own the night as much as the soldiers do, and every foxhole is theirs to claim. And when they finally retreat with their prizes, another sound rises to replace them. The snores, groans, and coughs of your comrades packed tightly together, proving that even the soldiers themselves could become one more obstacle to rest. The trench is never yours alone. Even if the rats retreat and the insects pause, you still have to share your space with the men around you. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder, packed into foxholes or dugouts, was its own form of torture. War removed privacy as easily as it removed comfort. At night, every soldier became not just your comrade but your mattress, blanket, and alarm clock rolled into one. In Europe, men dug foxholes big enough for 2, sometimes 3. It was practical, meant to conserve space and provide warmth. But warmth came at a cost. You woke to elbows in your ribs, knees pressed against your back, or worse, your comrade rolling over onto your arm and leaving it numb until dawn. Snoring was inevitable, echoing through the night louder than gunfire at times. A man who could somehow sleep through artillery would be jolted awake by the guttural growl of his neighbour snoring inches from his ear. Complaint solved nothing, because everyone contributed to the chorus eventually. Coughing was another constant. Colds and chest infections thrived in damp trenches. Soldiers hacked through the night, the sound carrying in waves down a line of dugouts. During the winter of 1944 in the Ardennes, doctors recorded entire companies suffering bronchitis and pneumonia. The air filled with a symphony of wheezes and phlegm. There were no tissues. Soldiers coughed into sleeves already stiff with grime, spreading sickness one shift at a time. Trying to rest beside this orchestra of contagion was as futile as sleeping in a factory. In tropical climates, body odour magnified the misery. Packed together in jungle bivouacs, men stank of sweat, mildew, and rotting uniforms. The heat made them lie with as little clothing as possible, pressing sticky skin against one another in the dark. Every turn shifted the smell, sending fresh waves of mildew, unwashed socks, and sour breath into the cramped air. Some soldiers slept outdoors rather than endure the press of comrades, risking mosquitoes and leeches just to escape the suffocating proximity. The spread of disease was inevitable. Lice, fleas, and fungi leapt easily from one man to another in such close quarters. Trench foot spread in clusters, as damp boots and filthy bedding made infection communal. In the Pacific, jungle rot spread across entire squads, the fungus eating through legs like a slow fire. Sleeping close to others meant sharing not only warmth, but illness. A soldier's cough or sore became everyone's burden. Then there was the noise of conversation. Men whispered in the dark, trying to distract themselves from fear. Some prayed aloud. Others muttered about food, family, or home. The talk never really stopped. For one man, it was a comfort. For another, it was agony. The reminder that rest was out of reach. Even silence could not be trusted, broken by sudden laughter, screams from nightmares, or the guttural moans of men reliving trauma in their sleep. You shift closer to the man beside you, and his boots dig into your hip. His breath hits your neck, hot and sour. He jerks awake briefly, mutters something incomprehensible, then collapses again, rolling against you with the weight of a sack of sand. You are trapped, squeezed between flesh and fabric, the air stale and suffocating. Sleep becomes impossible not from fear or cold, but from the claustrophobia of too much humanity pressed into too little space. The absurd coping tactics reappear here as well. Soldiers stuffed rags into their ears to block snores. Some volunteered for night watch rather than endure the stink and noise of group sleep. Others shifted constantly, creating a chain reaction of tossing and turning that rippled through entire dugouts. A few found humour in the situation, comparing their quarters to livestock pens or crowded trains. But even the jokes carried bitterness. No one wanted to share such intimacy with dozens of strangers in such foul conditions, and yet shared misery created bonds. Soldiers wrote later that sleeping so close forced men into reluctant brotherhoods. A man who snored through the night might save your life in the morning. The same cough that kept you awake might warn you that your comrade was too sick to fight. The very lack of privacy, though unbearable, forged connections that outlasted the war. Some veterans remembered the smell and the closeness more vividly than the battles. Still, in the moment, it was misery. Every night was a communal struggle against snoring, coughing, stink, and claustrophobia. You never had a bed to yourself, never a quiet corner, never true solitude. Even in rest you belonged to the group, tangled in a knot of exhaustion and filth. And when dawn finally came, it wasn't peace that greeted you. It was the sound of boots stomping, orders shouted, and the relentless demand to march again, proving that even the few hours of restless communal sleep were only temporary reprieves. And as you drag yourself from the trench, still stiff from a night spent wedged against others, you notice another reality. The ground beneath you is not just mud and snow. It is alive with insects, maggots and worms feeding on everything war leaves behind, which meant that sometimes you weren't just sleeping beside men, you were sleeping in soil that moved. You press your hands into the soil as you shift in the trench and it squirms. The ground is not just earth and mud, it is alive, moving with tiny bodies, feeding on the waste and wreckage of war. Sleep here means surrendering yourself to soil that writhes, a bed of maggots, worms and beetles that thrive in the very conditions that leave you sick and exhausted. Battlefields were fertile in the worst ways. Food scraps, unburied corpses, latrines that overflowed, all combined to make foxholes living compost heaps. Soldiers described digging trenches only to uncover swarms of white larvae wriggling through the soil. In hot climates, the cycle was faster. A dead animal, or worse, a fallen comrade, could fill with maggots in a single day. The smell alone was unforgettable. Soldiers compared it to sour milk left in the sun, multiplied by 100, and it clung to the nose for hours. Imagine trying to close your eyes while that stench crawled up from beneath you. In the Pacific, the problem was constant. The humidity turned every foxhole into a swamp, perfect for breeding flies. These flies laid eggs in anything organic, which meant discarded rations, clothing and wounds. Men woke to find their bandages infested, tiny worms feeding on pus and flesh. Field manuals recommended burning waste to prevent flies from breeding, but in practice soldiers lacked time or fuel. They lived in a cycle of infestation, swatting at clouds of flies by day and lying in maggot-laced mud by night. Europe had its own share of crawling earth. After heavy rains, worms surfaced by the hundreds, wriggling across blankets and boots. Soldiers joked that their foxholes were more like fishing ponds, yet humour collapsed when the worms brought bacteria with them, spreading infections into open sores. The soil itself became contaminated by waste and blood, and every scrape against the ground risked festering. You couldn't avoid contact. The foxhole was your home, your bed, your shield, and it was teeming with life you never wanted to meet. And then there were the beetles and other scavengers. In North Africa, dung beetles rolled their prizes directly into sleeping quarters. Soldiers lying on the sand woke to find insects pushing small balls of waste across their chests, as though they were part of the desert landscape. In Italy, cockroaches nested in abandoned gear, scattering in waves when men reached for their packs at night. Some soldiers swore the insects grew larger the longer they stayed in camp, feasting on scraps until they rivaled small rodents. The most grotesque encounters involved the dead. When battle left corpses unburied, they became magnets for flies. The resulting swarms spread larvae into the soil. Soldiers digging new foxholes sometimes uncovered what they described as living carpets of maggots beneath the top layer of dirt. These moments stuck in memory more vividly than any firefight. To sleep inches above such writhing life was to share space with the decomposition of the battlefield itself. You shift again, feeling the damp ground press into your skin, and the crawling sensation becomes unbearable. Whether or not the insects are truly there hardly matters. The paranoia of infestation haunted every soldier. Diaries describe men stripping naked in the dark, convinced that something was burrowing under their uniforms, only to collapse again minutes later, too exhausted to care. The boundary between real pests and imagined ones dissolved in the haze of sleepless nights. Armies tried solutions. Lime was spread in latrines to kill maggots, trenches were burned out with fuel, and medical staff lectured on cleanliness. Yet none of this worked under constant combat. Soldiers lived and slept in soil that was never sterile. They adapted instead. Some hardened themselves to the crawling sensations, shrugging off what they couldn't control. Others embraced grim humour, giving names to the larger worms or betting on which beetle would cross a trench faster. But laughter didn't erase the reality that every night meant bedding down in a living, crawling landscape. The consequences were more than psychological. Infections spread when insects entered wounds. Ulcers developed on skin that lay too long against infested earth. Dysentery and typhoid were carried from soil to food and back again. Military medicine noted that the environment itself, not just enemy action, accounted for a staggering share of casualties. Soldiers didn't just fight other men, they fought the ground beneath their feet. You close your eyes, trying to ignore the wriggling sensation against your arm, but sleep will not come. Every twitch feels like a maggot, every tickle like a worm, every gust of wind like something crawling beneath your clothes. The soil itself has become your enemy, a reminder that even the earth rejects your presence. And as you lie awake, clutching your gear tighter, you realise that sometimes the worst part of war wasn't the fighting at all. It was knowing that even the ground you slept on was trying to devour you. And if the crawling soil wasn't enough to rob soldiers of rest, the nightmares waiting inside their minds finished the job. For in a world of constant trauma, even when the body collapsed into slumber, the mind carried the war back into sleep. Imagine lying flat in a foxhole, mud seeping through your blanket, when silence should finally bring a few hours of rest. Yet silence almost never came in a battlefield camp. Instead, night brought a different kind of assault, one carried by sound. Sleep in war was a constant negotiation with noise, a barrage of bangs, rumbles, and unholy shrieks that turned every attempt at rest into another test of endurance. Artillery defined the soundscape. Even miles from the front, the ground shook with distant shelling, a low, rolling thunder that never seemed to stop. Soldiers described how their chests rattled with each explosion, even when the shells landed out of sight. Nearer to combat lines, artillery became more than background rumble. The whistle of shells overhead was unmistakable, followed by the gut-punching boom of impact. Try sleeping when every few minutes the earth itself quakes, as though it is rejecting your presence. Soldiers grew so accustomed to the noise that some could even distinguish which side had fired the gun based on the rhythm of the blast. Still, recognition didn't make the sound less terrifying, and it wasn't just artillery. Machine guns rattled through the night, stitching the dark with bursts of metallic thunder. A single burst could jolt an entire company awake, hearts racing before the realization set in that the shots were distant or aimed elsewhere. The sound of planes was even worse. Propellers droned endlessly, an ominous hum in the sky. Bombing raids turned that drone into a nightmare crescendo, with sirens, screaming bombs, and the roar of collapsing buildings echoing across the countryside. Even when the danger passed, the ringing in soldiers' ears lingered like a phantom battle that refused to stop. Then there were the unintentional noises, the ones made by exhausted men themselves. Snoring became a battlefield of its own. With dozens crammed into dugouts or tents, the chorus of snores reached comic extremes. Some soldiers joked that they preferred the artillery, because at least shells didn't go on for hours in a nasal monotone. Coughing added to the chorus. Camps were filled with lung infections from smoke, cold, and poor air circulation. A single bout of coughing could ripple through a tent like dominoes, one man hacking until another picked up the rhythm, until the whole group sounded like a tubercular orchestra. Animals made their own contributions. Rats scurried across supplies, squeaking as they fought over crumbs. In the Pacific, frogs croaked so loudly in the swampy darkness that men swore they were being mocked. Horses and mules in transport units stomped, whinnied, and shook their harnesses deep into the night. Dogs barked at shadows, adding to the paranoia that enemies were nearby. The combination of man, beast, and machine ensured that no camp ever rested in silence. Psychological noise was perhaps worse than the real thing. Soldiers conditioned themselves to wake at the slightest unusual sound. A snapping twig, a rustling in the brush, a cough too close to the trench wall, all could trigger a jolt of adrenaline. Sleep became fragmented, broken into short stretches of shallow rest. Diaries record how men grew paranoid at the smallest disturbances, convinced they were hearing infiltrators or patrols. Some even fired weapons at shadows or noises, waking everyone with unnecessary alarms. Ironically, ear protection was not an option. Cotton or cloth stuffed into ears dulled the ability to hear approaching danger, and failing to hear an enemy attack could mean death. The army valued alertness over sleep, leaving men with no defence against noise but exhaustion. The result was a generation of soldiers who learned to sleep through artillery blasts, a skill born of necessity rather than peace. The long-term toll of noise was staggering. Soldiers reported constant ringing in their ears, what doctors later recognised as tinnitus. Hearing loss became a hidden casualty of war, affecting countless veterans who had endured months of unrelenting explosions. Even more destructive were the psychological echoes. Long after leaving the battlefield, men flinched at the sound of fireworks, car backfires, or even slamming doors. The body remembered what the mind wanted to forget, and sleep never returned to normal. You lie there, trying to sink into the mud, but every crack of rifle fire makes you flinch. The croak of a frog sounds suspiciously like a cough. Someone nearby starts snoring like a saw through timber, and you can't decide which is worse, the thunder of shells or the rumble of human lungs. No pillow, no earplug, no trick of will can quiet the chaos. The battlefield itself is speaking, and it refuses to let you close your eyes. The irony is that men sometimes feared silence more than noise. A sudden stop in shelling or gunfire could signal preparation for an attack. Quiet meant something was coming. In those rare moments when the guns paused, sleep felt more impossible than ever. You waited, wide-eyed in the dark, ears straining for the first sign of disaster. The absence of noise became louder than the artillery itself. Night after night, men learned to accept it. Noise was not a temporary disruption. It was part of the environment, like the mud, the cold, and the insects. You didn't escape it. You lived with it, letting your body collapse into fitful micro-sleeps between the blasts. And in this strange rhythm of war, the human brain proved both fragile and absurdly resilient. Clinging to consciousness even as the world around you roared on without pause, noise became a weapon just as effective as bullets. It drained morale, broke concentration, and left men staggering through the day like the walking dead. Yet amid all of it, life in camp went on. Soldiers joked about the nightly symphony, calling it their orchestra of misery. They even gave nicknames to particularly loud snorers, treating them as unofficial conductors. Humour, however small, was the only way to survive the endless concert that defined every night. So if tonight's little lullaby of exploding shells, snoring soldiers, and rats chewing on your rations didn't quite rock you to sleep, let me know, down in the comments, what kind of historical suffering you'd like to drift off to next. Maybe you want the sweet sounds of medieval dentistry, or perhaps the soothing misery of a Victorian hat factory. And if you enjoy falling asleep while learning just how much worse life used to be, make sure to check out my other videos. After all, there's nothing like a bedtime story about humanity's collective discomfort to help you appreciate your own mattress.